The noon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Arizona territory. Heat waves shimmered off the packed earth, distorting the ramshackle buildings that lined both sides of the thoroughfare. It was the kind of scorching day that drove most folks indoors, leaving only the desperate and the foolish to brave the punishing heat. The stagecoach from Tucson rolled to a stop in front of the depot, its wheels groaning and horses snorting with exhaustion. The driver, a weathered man named Jake, spat tobacco juice into the dirt and called out, "Cedar Ridge, all out for Cedar Ridge." Among the handful of passengers who stumbled out was a woman who immediately drew stares. Not because she was beautiful, though beneath the dirt and bruises, she might have been, but because of her condition. Her once fine traveling dress hung torn and stained, one sleeve ripped at the shoulder. Purple-black bruises mottled her arms and face, and she moved with the careful, painful gait of someone nursing broken ribs. Sarah McAllister clutched a small carpet bag with white knuckles, her hazel eyes darting nervously at the gathering crowd. She'd come all the way from Pennsylvania, answering an advertisement for a mail-order bride. The man who'd sent for her, one William Thornton, had painted a picture of prosperity and respectability in his letters. A successful merchant, he'd claimed, with a fine house and gentle disposition. The reality had been devastatingly different. Thornton turned out to be a drunk and a gambler who'd lost his store months ago. When she'd arrived in Tucson 3 days prior, he'd flown into a rage upon seeing her, claiming she wasn't as pretty as her photograph suggested. The beating had been swift and brutal. This morning, he'd thrown her onto the Cedar Ridge stage with nothing but her bag and told her to get gone before I change my mind about letting you live. Now she stood in this foreign place, hundreds of miles from anything familiar, with 12 cents to her name and nowhere to go. Well, a voice drawled from the shadows of the depot porch. Look what the stage brought in. 3 men emerged, their eyes glittering with the kind of interest that made Sarah's stomach turn. The speaker, a thin man with yellowed teeth, looked her up and down like she was livestock at auction. "Damaged goods, by the look of her," another said, chuckling darkly, "but might still have some use left in her." Sarah backed away, but found herself against the hot wood of the stagecoach. The driver had already climbed back up to his seat, eager to move on to the next stop. Around them, townspeople watched with the detached curiosity of those who'd seen too much hardship to intervene in more. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" The thin man stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "We ain't offering trouble, sweetheart. Just a business proposition. Town like this. Woman alone. Well, there's ways to earn your keep." His meaning was clear, and Sarah felt her knees weaken. She'd heard stories of women forced into such lives, but never imagined she'd face that choice herself. Death might be preferable, she thought wildly, but even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew she wanted to live. She'd survived Thornton's fists. She'd survive this too, somehow. "The lady said she doesn't want trouble." The voice came from behind the men, deep and steady as bedrock. They turned, and Sarah saw him for the first time. He stood tall in the dusty street, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped in the way of men who worked hard for their living. His face was weathered by sun and wind, making his age hard to guess, anywhere from 30 to 45. Dark hair showed beneath a worn hat, and his clothes, while clean, had seen better days. Canvas pants, a faded blue shirt, boots worn down at the heels, a rancher, by the look of him. But it was his eyes that held her attention, gray as a winter sky. They held neither pity nor desire as they looked at her, just a calm assessment, like he was reading the whole story written in her bruises and torn dress. "This ain't your concern. Coleman," the thin man said, though he took a half-step back. "Woman's got no claim here, no kin, no husband. Makes her fair game." The rancher, Coleman, shifted slightly, and Sarah noticed the way his hand rested near the pistol at his hip. Not threatening, just ready. "Maybe so," Coleman said, but I'm making it my concern now. You looking to buy yourself a woman, Joe? One of the others jeered. Finally given up on finding one the regular way? Coleman didn't rise to the bait. His gaze never left the thin man's face. I'm looking to finish my business in town and head home. This woman's coming with me. It wasn't a question or a request, just a statement of fact, delivered in that same steady tone. Sarah's heart hammered. From one claimed ownership to another, but something in this man's bearing was different. He hadn't looked at her the way the others had, hadn't seen prey or property. She couldn't say what he had seen, but it wasn't that. Now hold on, the thin man started, but Coleman cut him off with a look. Tom, you've got a wife and 3 daughters at home. You really want to be the kind of man who stands here bargaining over a beaten woman like she's a side of beef? Coleman's voice remained level, but something in it made Tom flinch. And you, Pete, doesn't your mother still take in washing? How'd she feel knowing her son was out here playing vulture? The men shifted uncomfortably. In a town this small, everyone knew everyone, and Coleman had just reminded them of that fact. We weren't gonna, Pete mumbled, but trailed off. No, Coleman agreed. You weren't, because you're going back to whatever you were doing before the stage came in. For a moment, the standoff held. Then Tom spat in the dirt and turned away. Ain't worth the trouble anyway. Come on, boys. They slouched off, casting dark looks back but not willing to push the issue. Coleman waited until they disappeared into the saloon before turning to Sarah. Up close, she could see lines carved deep around his eyes, the kind that came from squinting into too many sunrises. His face was clean-shaven but rough, like he'd used a dull razor that morning. When he looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, she saw something flicker in those gray eyes. Not pity, exactly, recognition, maybe, like he knew what it was to be broken and alone. You're coming with me, he said. The same words the others might have used. But the meaning was entirely different. This wasn't a claim or a demand. It was an offer wrapped in plain-spoken certainty, the kind of help that came without flourish or expectation in this hard country. Sarah found her voice. I can't pay you. I have nothing to offer. Didn't ask for anything. Coleman picked up her carpetbag with his left hand, keeping his right free. Old habits, she realized. The habits of a man who'd learned to stay ready for trouble. Got a wagon at the livery. We've got 30 miles to cover before dark. He started walking, then paused when he realized she hadn't moved. Sarah stood frozen, overwhelmed by this sudden shift in her fortunes. Was she trading one form of captivity for another? Or was this weathered stranger truly offering what he seemed to be? Simple sanctuary, no strings attached? Ma'am, Coleman turned back, and she saw the faintest softening in his expression. Those ribs need tending. My ranch has medical supplies and a bed you can rest in. That's all I'm offering. A place to heal up and figure out your next move. Nothing more unless you want it to be. The directness of his words, the lack of honeycoating or false promises, decided her. In a land full of liars and sweet-talkers, this man's plain speech felt like solid ground. Sarah took a careful step forward, then another. Each movement hurt, but she kept walking. Coleman fell into step beside her, not too close, maintaining a respectful distance. As they made their way down the dusty street, she noticed how people stepped aside for him. Not from fear, exactly, but from a kind of wary respect. Thank you, she whispered. Coleman glanced at her, then away. No need for that. Man sees someone needs help. He helps, that's all. But Sarah knew it was more than that. In a town where beaten women were seen as damaged goods, where her bruises marked her as victim and therefore prey, this quiet rancher had seen her as human. That alone was worth more than all the promises William Thornton had ever made. As they walked toward the livery stable and whatever lay beyond, Sarah allowed herself the faintest spark of hope. She was still lost, still broken, still far from home, but for the first time since stepping off that train in Tucson, she wasn't alone. The sun continued its merciless assault on Cedar Ridge, but somehow, walking beside Joe Coleman toward his wagon and the unknown horizon beyond, It didn't seem quite so punishing anymore. The wagon ride had been long and mostly silent, broken only by the creak of wheels and the occasional snort from the horses. Sarah dozed fitfully, jerked awake each time they hit a rut, her ribs screaming protest. Coleman drove with the same steady calm he'd shown in town, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning its descent behind distant mesas. When they finally crested a low rise and she saw his ranch spread below, Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. It wasn't grand, nothing like the prosperous spread Thornton had described in his letters, but there was something honest about it, something real. The main house sat low and solid against the landscape, built from adobe and weathered timber. A barn stood off to one side, its doors hanging straight and true. Corrals held a dozen horses, and she could see cattle dotting the scrubland beyond. Everything spoke of careful maintenance and hard work, fences mended, tools stored properly, water troughs clean despite the drought. "It ain't much," Coleman said, the first words he'd spoken in miles. "But it's quiet. Quiet." After days of shouting and fists and fear, quiet sounded like salvation. He helped her down from the wagon, his hands careful and impersonal. Sarah bit back a groan as her feet touched ground, everything hurting worse after hours of jostling. Coleman noticed. She was learning he noticed most things, but didn't comment. Instead, he simply picked up her bag and headed for the house. Inside was much like outside, simple, clean, functional. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large fireplace dominating one wall, a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the window, shelves lined with preserved goods and a few books. Through one doorway she glimpsed what must be his bedroom, through another, a second, smaller room. Coleman set her bag down and moved to the stove, his movements efficient and practiced. "I'll heat some water. You'll want to clean up. There's salve in that cabinet there, calendula and comfrey. Good for bruises." He paused, his back to her. "Bedroom through there is yours long as you need it. Was meant for, well, it's empty now. Clean sheets in the trunk." Sarah stood uncertainly in the middle of the room, unsure what to do with this straightforward kindness. In her world, the world she'd known back east, men didn't just give without taking. There were always strings, always expectations. "Mr. Coleman." "Joe," he corrected, pumping water into a large pot. "Just Joe." "Joe." The name felt strange on her tongue. "I need to understand. Why are you doing this?" He set the pot on the stove and turned to face her, those gray eyes steady and unreadable. For a long moment he was quiet, and she thought he might not answer. Then he reached up and removed his hat, running a hand through dark hair shot with early silver. "Had a horse once," he said finally. "Found her half dead on the range. Beaten, starved, left to die. Brought her home. Figured she was too far gone but couldn't leave her there. Took months of patient work. Thought more than once she'd never trust again, never be whole." He set the hat on a peg by the door. "She's in the barn now. Best cow horse I ever had?" Sarah blinked, processing this. "You're comparing me to a horse?" The faintest hint of a smile touched his weathered face. "Comparing myself to the kind of man who can't walk past suffering without trying to ease it. That's all." The water began to steam. Joe poured it into a basin and set it on the table along with clean cloths and a bar of soap that smelled of lavender, an unexpected touch of gentleness in this masculine space. "I'll see to the animals," he said. "You take your time." He left her alone, and Sarah stood there fighting tears, not from pain this time, but from the simple shock of consideration. When had anyone last offered her privacy, time, space to breathe? Moving carefully, she explored the small bedroom. It was sparse but clean, a narrow bed with a colorful quilt, a dresser with a cracked mirror, hooks on the wall for clothes. On the windowsill sat a small wooden cross, the kind carved by patient hands during long winter evenings. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon light slanting through clean glass. Sarah returned to the main room and slowly, painfully, began to wash. The water was blessedly warm, and she hadn't realized how filthy she was until she saw it turning brown. Her hands shook as she worked around the worst of the bruises, cataloging damage. The ribs were the worst, but there were marks everywhere Thornton's fists had landed. She found the salve where Joe had indicated and applied it liberally, the herbal scent filling her nose. In the trunk in the bedroom, she discovered not only sheets but also clothing, simple dresses and undergarments, carefully folded and smelling of cedar. Women's clothes, waiting for a woman who'd never come. Sarah chose the plainest dress, a brown calico that had seen better days but was clean and whole. It hung loose on her frame. Whoever it had belonged to had been taller and fuller figured, but it was heaven after her ruined traveling clothes. When Joe returned, she was sitting at the table, hands folded, trying to look less broken than she felt. He glanced at her, taking in the clean face and borrowed dress, and nodded once. "Suits you," he said, then busied himself at the stove. Sarah watched him work, noting the economy of movement, the way he handled even simple tasks with focused attention. This was a man who'd been alone a long time, who'd learned to be complete unto himself. Yet here she was, disrupting his solitude, and he acted as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "Got stew from yesterday. Nothing fancy, but it's filling." Sarah's stomach answered before she could, growling loudly in the quiet room. She blushed, but Joe just nodded and ladled stew into 2 bowls. They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The stew was simple: beef, potatoes, carrots, onions. But after days of fear and pain, it tasted like a feast. Sarah found herself crying as she ate, tears rolling down her cheeks even as she spooned up every drop. Joe didn't comment, just pushed a handkerchief across the table and kept eating his own meal with steady purpose. When they finished, he cleared the bowls and returned to sit across from her. The sun was setting now, painting the room in shades of gold and amber. "Rules," he said simply. "You stay as long as you need. You don't owe me nothing, not work, not company, not explanation. You want to help out once you're healed up. That's fine. You want to sit and read those books all day. That's fine too. You decide to leave. I'll take you back to town or wherever you want to go. But until you decide, this is your home." Sarah stared at him, this weathered rancher offering sanctuary without conditions. "That's all?" "That's all." He stood, joints popping. "I rise early. Coffee's usually ready by dawn. I'll be working the range most days. Back by supper. Anything you need. You ask. Anything you don't want to talk about. You don't. Clear. Clear," she whispered. Joe moved to a cabinet and pulled out a bottle and 2 glasses. He poured a measure of amber liquid into each and pushed one toward her. "Whiskey," he said. "Good for the pain. Help you sleep." Sarah rarely drank, but she took the glass with trembling hands. The whiskey burned, but it was a clean burn, warming her from the inside out. "Why was the room ready?" she asked before she could stop herself. "The women's clothes." Joe stared into his own glass for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than before. "Built this place figuring on a family. Had a woman coming out from St. Louis, mail order, like you. She died on the way. Fever took her somewhere in Kansas." He took a slow sip. "That was 8 years ago. Never had the heart to clear out her things. Figured maybe." He shrugged. "Figured wrong." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Sarah understood now. This wasn't charity or pity. It was one broken soul recognizing another, offering what comfort could be shared between people who'd learned the world's hard lessons. "Thank you," she said again, and this time he didn't wave it off. "We all need a place to land when we fall," Joe said simply. He finished his whiskey and stood. "I'll be turning in. Lamp oil's precious, but use what you need tonight. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you some boots that fit. Those city shoes won't last a week out here." He paused at his bedroom door. "You're safe here. Sarah, whatever else you're worried about, you can let that go. Nobody comes here without my say-so. and I ain't giving it." Then he was gone, leaving her alone with the dying light and the first peace she'd known in longer than she could remember. Outside, night sounds began, cattle lowing, horses nickering, the distant call of a coyote. Inside, the house settled around her, old wood and adobe accepting her presence without judgment. Sarah sat in the rocking chair by the window, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of sage and wood smoke, and let herself believe, just for a moment, that she might survive this after all. In the morning there would be questions, decisions, the need to figure out what came next. But tonight, she had a roof over her head, food in her belly, and a locked door between her and the world. For now, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The days fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Joe moving quietly about the kitchen, trying not to wake her despite the thinness of the walls. She'd lie still, listening to the familiar sounds of morning routine, boots on wood floors, the scrape of a chair, the clink of a spoon against ceramic. By the time she emerged, he'd be gone, leaving behind evidence of his consideration. Coffee still warm on the stove, biscuits wrapped in cloth, sometimes a note in careful script telling her where he'd be working that day. Not that she needed to know, but the gesture touched her, this acknowledgement that someone might wonder, might care where he was. The first week, she did little but heal. The salve worked its slow magic on her bruises, fading them from purple-black to green-yellow. Her ribs still protested sudden movements, but the sharp, breath-stealing pain had dulled to a manageable ache. She spent hours in the rocking chair, dozing in patches of sunlight like a cat, letting her body remember what it felt like to exist without constant vigilance. Joe came home each evening as the sun touched the western hills, dusty and tired but never short-tempered. He'd wash at the pump outside, change his shirt, and set about making supper with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. They ate together, conversation sparse but companionable, learning each other's rhythms without the need for many words. It was during the second week that Sarah began to venture beyond her chair. She tidied the already neat house, organized the shelves, mended a tear in one of the kitchen curtains. Small things, but Joe noticed. She caught him pausing in the doorway one evening, taking in the subtle changes with those observant gray eyes. "You don't have to," he said. "I know." She replied, "I want to." He nodded and said nothing more. But that night there were 2 pieces of pie instead of 1, and he'd brought in a handful of wildflowers in a mason jar, setting them on the table without comment. By the 3rd week, Sarah had established her own routine. She rose not long after Joe, made breakfast while he tended the horses, and had it ready when he came in. He always looked surprised, as if he couldn't quite believe she was still there, still choosing to be part of this quiet life. "You're spoiling me," he said one morning, surveying the spread of eggs and bacon and fresh biscuits. "Consider it rent," Sarah said, trying for lightness. His face grew serious. "You don't owe—" "I know." She cut him off gently. "But I need to feel useful. Let me have this?" Understanding flickered in his eyes. The need to contribute, to not be beholden. He knew that need. He sat down and ate without further protest, but she noticed he savored each bite more than usual. After breakfast, Joe would head out to work the cattle or mend fences or any of the dozen tasks that kept a ranch running. Sarah would clean up, then tackle whatever project she'd set for herself. She discovered a neglected vegetable garden behind the house and spent days clearing weeds and coaxing life back into the dry soil. She found his mending pile and worked through it, patching worn shirts and darning socks with tiny, careful stitches. In the afternoons, when the heat drove even the lizards to shade, she explored his small library. The books were an eclectic mix, practical volumes on animal husbandry and agriculture, a worn Bible, a collection of Shakespeare, and, surprisingly, several novels. She traced the names written inside the covers. Some said Joe Coleman in his careful hand. Others bore a different name, Margaret Shaw, written in flowing feminine script. The woman from St. Louis, she realized, the one who'd never made it. One evening, emboldened by weeks of quiet companionship, Sarah asked about her. They were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of rose and gold. Joe had built the porch chairs himself. She'd learned, during his first winter here, when the loneliness had threatened to drive him back to wherever he'd come from. What was she like? Margaret? Joe was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief worn smooth by time. "Don't rightly know," he admitted. "We exchanged maybe a dozen letters. She seemed hopeful. Said she was tired of city life. Wanted something real. Wanted children, a garden, a place to build something lasting." He shifted in his chair, wood creaking. "Might have been perfect. Might have been a disaster. Never got the chance to find out. Do you regret it? Trying?" "No." The answer came quick and certain. "Regret not trying harder to go fetch her myself. Regret letting her travel alone, but not the trying, never the trying." Sarah pulled her shawl closer against the evening chill. "I regret it," she said softly. "Answering that advertisement, coming west, trusting a stranger's letters." "That's different," Joe said. "You were lied to? Margaret and I. We were honest with each other. Much as two strangers can be, both knew it was a gamble. Just happened to lose." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness crept across the land. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped and was answered by another. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah ventured. Joe made a sound that might have been agreement. "Why do you stay? Out here, alone? You could go somewhere with people. Possibilities." He was quiet again, and Sarah had learned to wait out his silences. They usually meant he was choosing his words with care. "Came here to disappear," he said finally. "Found out I liked being disappeared. The land doesn't ask questions, doesn't judge what you were before, just cares what you do today, whether you work hard. Treat the animals right, respect what it gives and takes." He paused. "Been times I thought about leaving. After Margaret, especially. But this place, it's mine, built with these hands, paid for in sweat and stubbornness. That means something." Sarah understood. Back east, she'd been the minister's daughter who'd caused a scandal by refusing to marry the man her father chose. She'd been the woman who'd answered a matrimonial advertisement out of desperation, not romance. She'd been whispered about, judged, found wanting. Here, she was just Sarah, the woman who made good biscuits and coaxed the garden back to life, the woman who could make Joe almost smile when she managed to surprise him with some small improvement to the house. It was a clean slate, written in dust and silence and the endless blue sky. As the weeks passed, their evening conversations grew longer, though never what anyone would call chatty. Sarah learned that Joe had come from Missouri originally, though he deflected questions about what had driven him west. She learned he could play the harmonica, though he was shy about it. She learned he had a sweet tooth and hoarded peppermint sticks like a child. In turn, she told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, about her father's rigid expectations and her mother's quiet disappointment, about the suffocating weight of respectability and the desperate need to be somewhere, anywhere else, about the hope that had carried her west and the brutal reality that had greeted her. "Thornton wasn't the first to court me through letters," she admitted one night, "but he wrote so beautifully, painted such pictures of the life we'd have. I should have known it was too good to be true. Believing people ain't a fault," Joe said. "World would be a sorrier place if nobody trusted nobody." "You didn't trust those men in town, the ones who wanted—" She couldn't finish. "That's different. Those men showed their nature plain, no mystery what they were after." His jaw tightened. "Man who hits a woman, man who sees hurt and thinks opportunity. That kind shows himself clear enough. You're Thornton. He hid his nature. That's worse. In my book, that's the real evil." It was the most emotion she'd heard from him, and it warmed something in her chest. Not that he was angry on her behalf, she didn't need a defender, but that he understood the distinction, the particular cruelty of deception. That night, as she lay in the narrow bed listening to the wind whisper through the rafters, Sarah realized something had shifted. The house no longer felt like a refuge she was borrowing. It felt like home. And Joe, Joe felt like something she didn't quite have words for yet. Not a savior, not a keeper. Maybe just a friend. Maybe the first real friend she'd ever had. The thought scared her almost as much as it comforted her. Because friends could be lost. Friends could decide you weren't worth the trouble after all. Friends could discover who you really were and turn away. But the next morning, Joe was there as always, trying to be quiet, failing as always. And Sarah rose to make breakfast, falling into the pattern they'd built together out of silence and small kindnesses and the shared understanding of two people who'd learned to be alone and were carefully, cautiously learning to be less so. When he came in from feeding the horses and found fresh coffee and warm biscuits waiting, the smile that flickered across his weathered face was worth any risk. And when he said, "Morning, Sarah," in that quiet way of his, it sounded like a promise, not of romance or forever or any of the things William Thornton had promised in his lying letters, just a promise that today would be like yesterday, safe and steady and real. For now, for a woman still healing inside and out, that was more than enough. It was everything. The need for supplies finally drove them to town 2 months after Sarah's arrival. She'd been content to stay within the boundaries of the ranch, safe in the bubble of routine and quiet companionship. But flour was running low, along with coffee and other essentials, and Joe couldn't put off the trip any longer. "You don't have to come," he said that morning, studying her over his coffee cup. "I can manage fine on my own." Sarah's hands stilled on the dish she was washing. The thought of facing Cedar Ridge again, of seeing those leering faces and remembering her desperate state that day, made her stomach clench. But stronger than the fear was another feeling, defiance. She wouldn't hide forever. "I need some things," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Fabric for a new dress, thread, maybe some seeds for the garden if they have any." Joe nodded slowly, and she saw understanding in his eyes. He knew this wasn't about supplies. They left after breakfast, Sarah wearing her best borrowed dress and a bonnet she'd found in Margaret's trunk. The clothes still hung loose, but weeks of regular meals had begun to fill out her frame. The worst of the bruises had faded completely, though her ribs still twinged when she moved too quickly. The ride to town passed mostly in silence, but it was their usual comfortable quiet rather than tension. Joe had positioned her on his left side in the wagon. She noticed, keeping his gun hand free, old habits that probably had stories behind them, stories she might never hear. Cedar Ridge looked exactly as she remembered, dusty, tired, baking under the relentless sun. The same ramshackle buildings, the same faces turning to stare as their wagon rolled down Main Street, but something was different this time. She was different. "I'll get the supplies," Joe said, pulling up in front of the general store. "You want to come in or wait here?" Sarah lifted her chin. "I'll come." The store was dim after the bright sunlight, smelling of pickle brine and leather and 100 other things. Mrs. Garrett, the proprietor's wife, looked up from her knitting and froze when she saw Sarah. Her eyes darted between them, taking in Sarah's improved appearance and Joe's protective stance. "Mr. Coleman," she said carefully, "and Miss." "Ma'am," Joe replied with a tip of his hat. "Need the usual order, plus whatever the lady wants to look at." Sarah felt the weight of the woman's stare as she moved through the store, selecting thread and needles, running her fingers over bolts of fabric. She chose a practical blue calico and a prettier green that reminded her of spring back home. When she brought her selections to the counter, Mrs. Garrett's expression had shifted from shock to something like curiosity. "That's a lovely color," the older woman ventured. "We'll make up nice." "Thank you," Sarah replied, meeting her eyes steadily. The bell above the door chimed, and Sarah's shoulders tensed. But it was only another woman, younger, with a baby on her hip and a toddler clinging to her skirts. She glanced at Sarah with interest but not hostility. "Morning, Kate," Joe said, and Sarah realized with surprise that his voice held warmth. "Joe Coleman," the young woman scolded, though she was smiling. "You haven't been to Sunday dinner in 3 months. James is starting to think you've forgotten us." "Been busy," Joe said, and Sarah didn't miss the slight color that rose in his weathered cheeks. Kate's eyes moved to Sarah, bright with friendly curiosity. "I can see that." "This is Sarah," Joe said simply. "Sarah, Kate Morrison. Her husband James runs the smithy." "Pleased to meet you," Kate said warmly, shifting the baby to extend her hand. Sarah took it, surprised by the firm grip. "Are you settling in well?" The question could have held judgment, implications, but Kate's tone was genuinely kind. Sarah found herself relaxing slightly. "Yes, thank you. The quiet is healing." Something in Kate's expression softened. "I remember that feeling. I came out from Chicago 5 years ago. The adjustment was hard, but now I can't imagine living anywhere else." She turned to Joe. "You'll bring her to dinner Sunday. No excuses this time. James wants to talk to you about that horse you mentioned, and I'm desperate for female company that doesn't drool or ask for candy every 5 minutes. Joe glanced at Sarah, leaving the decision to her. She thought of another test, another chance to face the world beyond the ranch. "We'd be honored," she said. Kate beamed. "Wonderful. Come around too. And Sarah, don't let him convince you that his hermit ways are normal. Man needs people, even if he pretends otherwise." She bustled out with her children, leaving Joe looking mildly uncomfortable and Sarah fighting a smile. They finished their purchases. Mrs. Garrett warming considerably as she tallied their order. They were loading the wagon when Sarah heard the voice that made her blood run cold. Well, looks like Coleman's charity case cleaned up nice." Tom, the thin man from that first day, stood with 2 companions outside the saloon. His yellow teeth showed in what might have been meant as a smile, but looked more like a sneer. "Gentlemen," Joe said evenly, continuing to load sacks of flour. "Heard you've been keeping her out at your place." Tom continued, moving closer. "All alone, just the 2 of you. Mighty cozy arrangement." Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. She kept her eyes forward, chin high, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. "Also heard she came here as a mail-order bride," one of the others added. "Bought and paid for, then returned as damaged goods. Makes a man wonder what kind of damage we're talking about." "Makes a man wonder why you're so interested in my business," Joe said, still in that even tone, though Sarah saw the tension in his shoulders. Tom laughed, an ugly sound. "Just looking out for you, Coleman. Wouldn't want you getting stuck with another man's leavings, though I suppose beggars can't be choosers. Man your age, living alone so long, probably grateful for whatever he can." Joe moved so fast Sarah almost missed it. One moment he was standing by the wagon. The next, he had Tom pressed against the saloon wall, forearm across his throat. The other 2 men stepped back, hands moving toward their guns but not drawing. "You're going to apologize to the lady," Joe said quietly. His voice hadn't risen, but something in it made the hair on Sarah's neck stand up. This was a different Joe than the one who made her coffee and mended fences. This was the Joe who'd come west to disappear, and she wondered for the first time what exactly he'd been before. "I didn't mean," Tom wheezed. "Apologize." Joe pressed harder. "Then you're going to walk away. And if I hear you've been spreading tales or bothering her in any way, we'll have a different kind of conversation. Clear?" "Clear," Tom gasped. When Joe released him, he stumbled, straightening his shirt with shaking hands. "Sorry, miss, didn't mean nothing by it." Sarah looked at him with all the dignity she could muster. "Your apology is accepted." The 3 men retreated quickly, casting nervous glances back. Joe returned to the wagon as if nothing had happened, but Sarah saw the way his hands trembled slightly as he lifted the last sack. They were a mile out of town before either spoke. "I'm sorry," Sarah said quietly. "I've brought trouble to your door." Joe glanced at her, and she was surprised to see something almost like amusement in his eyes. That wasn't trouble. That was Tom Briggs being Tom Briggs. Man's been a fool and a bully since he was 10 years old. Every so often someone needs to remind him of his manners. "You scared them." "Good." "You scared me a little," she admitted. He was quiet for a moment. "I'd never hurt you, Sarah. Need you to know that." "I do know that. she said, and realized it was true. Even seeing that flash of violence, that glimpse of whoever he'd been before, she wasn't afraid of him. But they'll talk. They'll make assumptions about us. Joe shrugged. Let them talk. Their opinions don't put food on my table or hay in my barn. He glanced at her again. Unless it bothers you. The talk. Sarah thought about it. Really thought about it. Back east, such rumors would have destroyed her. Her reputation would have been ruined beyond repair. But here, what reputation did she have to protect? She'd already been branded as damaged goods. A fallen woman. A mail-order bride who couldn't even manage that degradation successfully. No, she said finally. It doesn't bother me. And it didn't. Let them think what they wanted. She knew the truth, that Joe Coleman had offered her sanctuary without price, that he treated her with more genuine respect than any man she'd known, that whatever existed between them was clean and honest and theirs alone. Good, Joe said, and she heard relief in his voice. Hate for you to feel you had to leave because of gossip. The idea of leaving hit her like a physical blow. When had the ranch stopped being a temporary refuge and become the place she wanted to stay? When had Joe stopped being a kind stranger and become essential? I don't want to leave, she said softly. Joe's hands tightened on the reins, just for a moment. Good, he said again. Gruffer this time. Garden's finally producing. Hate to see that work go to waste? Sarah smiled, understanding what he couldn't say. The garden was flourishing. It was true, but so were they. In their quiet way. Two damaged souls creating something that might not be conventional or proper, but was real and true and theirs. The ranch came into view, and Sarah felt the familiar loosening in her chest. Home, whatever the town thought, whatever assumptions they made. This was home now. We don't have to go to the Morrisons on Sunday. Joe said, if you'd rather not. No, Sarah said firmly. We'll go. Kate seems lovely, and you need friends beyond your cattle. Joe made a non-committal sound, but she caught the slight upturn of his mouth. He'd enjoyed seeing Kate and her children. She realized. He just needed someone to push him past his hermit tendencies. Maybe they were good for each other that way. Maybe that's what this was, not romance, not dependency, but partnership. Two people who understood broken things, helping each other remember how to be whole. The thought warmed her more than the desert sun, and Sarah allowed herself a small, private smile. Whatever Cedar Ridge thought, whatever tales Tom Briggs spread in the saloon, she and Joe would continue on as they had been, building something quiet and strong and entirely their own. The discovery happened by accident on a day when the august heat drove even the lizards to seek shade. Sarah was cleaning the spare room, though it had become hers. She still thought of it that way when she knocked over a stack of books on the high shelf. As she bent to retrieve them, something else fell, a leather portfolio, worn and cracked with age. She shouldn't have looked. It wasn't hers to examine, but the portfolio had fallen open, and the image staring up at her made her freeze. It was a charcoal drawing of a woman, executed with obvious skill and care. She had dark hair pinned up in the fashion of a decade past, intelligent eyes, and a smile that suggested secrets. But it wasn't Margaret Shaw. Sarah had seen the tintype Joe kept in the main room. This was someone else, someone who had mattered enough to be captured in loving detail. Behind the portrait were other papers. Letters, she realized, though she didn't read them. Just seeing the feminine handwriting was enough. And at the bottom of the portfolio, wrapped in oilcloth, a wanted poster, yellow with age. Joseph Coleman, it read. Wanted for murder in the territory of Missouri, armed and dangerous. Reward, $500. Sarah's hands shook as she carefully returned everything to the portfolio. The sketch on the poster was cruder than the charcoal drawing, but recognizable. Joe, years younger, clean-shaven, with eyes that held none of the steady calm she knew. She was still kneeling there, portfolio in her lap, when she heard his boots on the porch. There was no time to return it to its hiding place. He entered to find her frozen, Guilty. The evidence of her snooping plain between them. Joe stopped in the doorway. His face went very still, the way it had that day with Tom Briggs. But this was different. This wasn't anger. This was the look of a man watching something precious slip away.
"I'm sorry,"
Sarah whispered.
"It fell, and I—"
"It's all right," he said, though his voice suggested otherwise. He moved into the room slowly, as if she were a spooked horse that might bolt. Was bound to come out eventually. He sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly looking every one of his 40-odd years. Sarah stayed where she was, the portfolio between them like an accusation. "Her name was Elizabeth," he said finally. "My wife." Wife. The word hit Sarah like a physical blow. Not a sweetheart left behind, but a wife. "We had a small farm outside Independence." Joe continued, staring at his hands. "Nothing grand, but it was ours. She kept chickens, had a garden twice the size of yours, could make anything grow. That woman." His voice held a tenderness that made Sarah's chest tight. "We were married 3 years. Happy years." He fell silent, and Sarah waited, knowing the rest would come in its own time. There was a man, Samuel Morrison, no relation to James here in town. He owned the neighboring property, wanted our water rights, offered to buy us out more than once, but Elizabeth loved that place, wouldn't hear of leaving. Joe's hands clenched and unclenched. Morrison didn't like being told no, especially by a woman. Sarah could see where this was going, felt sick with the knowledge. "I was in town when he came by that last time, brought 2 of his hands with him. Elizabeth was alone." Joe's voice had gone flat, emotionless. "Neighbor boy saw them ride up, heard her screaming. By the time he fetched me—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "She was still alive when I got there. Barely had time to tell me she loved me, that it wasn't my fault. Died in my arms right there in her garden, blood soaking into the soil she'd tended so careful." Tears ran down Sarah's face, but she didn't move, didn't speak. This pain was his to share or hold as he chose. "I went to the sheriff. Morrison had already been there, spinning tales. Said Elizabeth had invited his attention, that she'd been meeting him, secret-like. Said when he tried to break it off, she'd gone wild, attacked him. His men backed every word." Joe laughed bitterly. Sheriff believed them, or pretended to. Morrison owned half the county by then. "So you killed him," Sarah said softly. Not a question. "So I killed him." Joe met her eyes for the first time since he'd started talking. "Waited 2 days. Let him think he'd won. Then I walked into his house during dinner, in front of his wife and children and guests. And I shot him dead. Didn't hide it, didn't run. Wanted everyone to know why. But the poster—" Morrison had friends. Judge, sheriff, most of the town council. They tried me quick, found me guilty quicker. I was set to hang when some of Elizabeth's people— she had Cherokee blood, her grandmother's side— helped me escape. Been Joe Coleman instead of— He stopped. "You don't have to tell me your real name," Sarah said quickly. He studied her face. "Still want to stay, knowing what I am, what I did?" Sarah thought about it, really thought about it. The man before her had killed. Not in self-defense, not in hot blood, but in cold vengeance. He was a fugitive, a wanted man, living under a false name. Everything about her upbringing, her father's teachings, said she should be horrified. Instead, she thought about Elizabeth, alone and afraid, dying in her beloved garden. She thought about powerful men who took what they wanted and twisted the truth to suit themselves. She thought about justice denied and grief so deep it drove a good man to murder. "Yes," she said simply. "I still want to stay." Something shifted in Joe's face, relief, gratitude, and something deeper she couldn't name. "The poster's 10 years old," he said. "Trail's long cold. Built myself a new life here. Tried to be a different man, better man. But I can't undo what I did, can't bring her back, can't even visit her grave." Sarah moved then, closing the distance between them. She sat beside him on the bed, not touching but close enough that he could feel her presence. "You're not that man anymore." she said. "The Joe Coleman I know is gentle and patient and kind. He saves broken things instead of breaking them." "Maybe," Joe said. "Or maybe I'm just better at hiding the violence. I've seen you violent." Sarah reminded him. "With Tom Briggs, you could have hurt him badly, but you didn't. You controlled it. Used just enough to make your point. That's not a man who enjoys violence. That's a man who understands it's sometimes necessary but takes no pleasure in it." They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Joe reached for the portfolio, drawing out the charcoal portrait. "Drew this on our 2nd anniversary," he said. She complained the whole time about sitting still, but she was secretly pleased. Always was vain about her hair. His finger traced the curve of the drawn cheek. "Sometimes I can barely remember her voice. Been so long, but I still see her clear as day when I close my eyes. You loved her very much." "I did, do. Always will." He looked at Sarah. "That bother you?" Sarah considered. Did it bother her? There was a twinge of something, not jealousy exactly, but awareness that she was living in a house built for another woman, wearing clothes meant for another future, tending a garden planted by hands now dust. "No," she said finally. "Love like that doesn't diminish. It just is. She was part of making you who you are. How could I resent that?" Joe studied her with those gray eyes that missed nothing. "You're a remarkable woman. Sarah McAllister?" "I'm a practical woman," she corrected. "We've all got our ghosts. Yours just have names and faces." He carefully returned the portrait to the portfolio, then surprised her by not hiding it away again. Instead, he placed it on the dresser, in plain sight. "No more secrets," he said. "You deserve to know who you're sharing a roof with." "I already knew." Sarah said, "Maybe not the details, but I knew you were running from something, hiding from something. It's in the way you check the horizon, the way you sleep light, the way you built this place so far from anything." She paused. "Takes one to know one, I suppose. You're not running from the law." "No, just from a life that was crushing me slow, from expectations I couldn't meet and a future I couldn't bear." She stood, smoothing her skirts. "We're both fugitives in our way." Joe stood too, and for a moment they faced each other in the small room, the weight of shared truth between them. "The name on the poster," he said suddenly. It was Joseph Tanner. Sarah absorbed this gift, this final trust. "Thank you for telling me, but you're Joe Coleman to me. That's who you've chosen to be, and that's who matters." He nodded, and she saw the tension leave his shoulders. The secret that had stood between them, though she hadn't known it was there, was gone. In its place was something newer, deeper, not the desperate love he'd had with Elizabeth, but something that might grow just as strong given time and tending. "I'll start supper," Sarah said, moving toward the door. "Sarah." She turned back. "I'm glad it was you who found it. Glad I don't have to carry it alone anymore." She smiled, feeling the truth of that in her own bones. They were both carrying less alone than they had before. Grief and secrets and the weight of lives that hadn't gone according to plan. Together, the load was bearable. Together, they might even find their way to something like peace. As she prepared their simple meal, Sarah thought about Elizabeth, about the woman who had loved Joe Tanner so deeply he'd killed for her. She hoped, wherever Elizabeth was, she understood that her husband was trying to honor her memory by living well, by choosing kindness over continued violence, by building something new on the ashes of the old. And maybe, Sarah thought as Joe came in for supper, moving with the careful grace of a man learning to trust again, maybe that was the best memorial of all. The decision came to Sarah on a crisp October morning when the first hint of autumn touched the desert air. She stood in her small room, holding the torn remnants of her traveling dress, the one she'd arrived in, stained with tears and blood and the memory of William Thornton's fists. For months it had hung in the back of the wardrobe, a reminder of who she'd been, what she'd escaped. But she wasn't that woman anymore. That desperate, broken creature who'd stumbled off the stage in Cedar Ridge belonged to another life, another world. The woman she was now, brown from the sun, strong from honest work, steady from Joe's quiet companionship, had no need for such reminders. She gathered the dress along with other relics, the packet of letters from Thornton, full of honeyed lies and false promises, the marriage contract she'd signed in good faith, believing she was heading toward a new life rather than a nightmare. A cheap brass ring Thornton had shoved on her finger at the station in Tucson, claiming it would do until he could afford better. Even the advertisement she'd torn from the Pennsylvania newspaper, carefully preserved despite everything. The words that had started her journey west, outside. Joe was splitting wood for winter, the steady thwack of his axe rhythmic as a heartbeat. Sarah watched him through the window for a moment, the sure swing of his arms, the way he paused to wipe sweat from his brow, the simple grace of a man at useful labor. How different from Thornton's soft hands and softer character. She waited until evening, when the chores were done and they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the mountains purple and gold. The bundle rested in her lap, wrapped in an old flour sack.
I want to burn these,
she said without preamble. Joe glanced at the bundle, then at her face. He didn't ask what was inside. Maybe he could guess, or maybe he simply understood that the what mattered less than the why. There's a clear spot out back, he said, away from the buildings. I'll fetch some kindling. He didn't try to talk her out of it, didn't suggest she think it over or wait for another day. He simply stood and went to gather wood, accepting her decision as he accepted everything, quietly, completely. They built the fire together as darkness crept across the desert. Joe arranged the wood with the same careful attention he brought to every task, making sure it would burn hot and clean. When the flames caught and rose, dancing against the deepening sky, he stepped back and waited. Sarah approached the fire slowly, feeling the weight of what she carried in more than just her arms. Each item held memory, mostly painful, but some touched with the desperate hope she'd felt leaving Pennsylvania. That woman seemed like a stranger now, naive and foolish, but brave in her own way. She'd risked everything on the promise of a better life. It wasn't her fault the promise had been false. The dress went first. The fabric caught quickly, silk and cotton consuming in a rush of orange flame. She watched the bloodstains disappear, the tears become ash. The last evidence of Thornton's violence transform into smoke that dissipated in the evening air. The letters followed. His lies curled and blackened, words of love and devotion revealing their true nature as they burned. The marriage contract took longer, the heavy paper resisting before finally surrendering to the flames. The brass ring she threw with force, watching it disappear into the glowing heart of the fire. Last was the advertisement. Sarah held it longest, reading once more the words that had changed everything. Seeking refined lady of good character for matrimony. Prosperous merchant in Arizona territory desires companionship with view toward family. Will provide comfortable home and kind treatment. Kind treatment. The bitter irony of it made her throat tight. But without this lie, she never would have come west. Never would have found Joe, the ranch, this life she was building from the ashes of the old. Strange how the worst thing that had happened to her had led to the best. She let the paper fall. The fire consumed it hungrily, and with it went the last of who she'd been before. Good, Joe said softly. It was the first word either had spoken since they'd begun. Sarah stood watching the fire burn down, feeling oddly empty. Not sad, not relieved, just empty, like a house cleaned of old furniture, waiting to see what would fill the space. Joe disappeared into the house and returned with 2 cups and a bottle. Not whiskey this time, but something that smelled of apples and spice. Cider, he explained. Kate Morrison sent it. Been saving it for something worth marking. They drank in companionable silence, the sweet burn of the cider warming Sarah from inside as the fire warmed her skin. When her cup was empty, Joe took it and set both aside. There's something else, he said, and she heard an unfamiliar note in his voice. Uncertainty, maybe, or hope. He reached into his pocket and drew out something small, wrapped in a bit of calico. This wasn't meant to... It's not... He stopped, took a breath. started again. When a person burns their past, seems like they ought to have something to mark their future. Sarah unwrapped the cloth with trembling fingers. Inside was a ring, clearly handmade, forged from what looked like steel. It was nothing like the ornate jewelry she'd seen back east, nothing like even the cheap brass Thornton had given her. But there was beauty in its simplicity, in the careful work that had shaped raw metal into this circle. Inside, she could make out tiny marks etched into the metal, not words, but symbols, brands. She realized, the brands of his ranch, of this place that had become home. "It's not a proposal," Joe said quickly. Not that kind of ring, unless you want it to be. But I thought," he struggled, this man of few words trying to find the right ones. "You gave me my life back when you stayed after learning about Elizabeth, about what I did. Figured maybe I could give you something to show your life here is real, permanent, if you want it to be." Sarah turned the ring in the firelight, seeing how the flames danced on the polished metal. He was right. It wasn't a proposal in the traditional sense. It was something else, maybe something more. Not a promise of romance or passion, but of partnership, of belonging, of choosing to build something together from the broken pieces of their separate pasts. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's just steel, nothing fancy, but it won't tarnish or break. Made it from a piece of the old windmill that was here when I bought the place. Figured something that survived this land so long might have staying power. Like us," Sarah thought, battered by storms but still standing. She held out her left hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Joe took the ring and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Of course it did. He'd probably been measuring her hands for weeks without her noticing, planning this with the same quiet determination he brought to everything. "I don't know what we are," Sarah said, looking at their joined hands. "Or what we're building." "Does it matter?" Joe asked. "We're here. We're helping each other heal. We're making something good from something broken. Maybe that's enough definition for now." The fire had burned down to coals, glowing like tiny stars in the darkness. Sarah could no longer see any trace of what she'd burned. Dress, letters, old life all transformed into ash that would feed the desert soil. Tomorrow wind would scatter even that, and it would be like none of it had ever existed. But the ring caught the dying light, solid and real on her finger. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not erasing the past, but choosing to build anyway, to create anyway, to trust anyway. "Let me build something real from something broken," Joe said softly, echoing words he must have been thinking about for a while. "Yes," Sarah said, and the word held weight, held promise, held all the hope she'd thought burned away with her blood-stained dress. "Yes." They sat by the dying fire until full dark, not touching except for that first moment when he'd placed the ring, but connected nonetheless. Two people who'd lost everything finding that maybe, just maybe, there was still something left to gain, something worth building, something worth protecting. When the last coal faded and the desert cold crept in, they went inside together. Sarah made tea while Joe banked the stove for the night. Such ordinary tasks, but weighted now with new meaning. This wasn't just routine anymore. This was chosen. This was theirs. As she lay in her narrow bed that night, Sarah turned the ring on her finger, feeling the etched brands that marked her as belonging to this place, this life, this quiet man who understood that some wounds never fully healed, but you could build good things anyway. Outside, wind scattered the ashes of her old life across the desert. "Let them go," she thought. "Let them feed the stubborn plants that grew here, the ones that had learned to survive on almost nothing and bloom anyway." She was one of those plants now, transplanted, battered by storms, but finally taking root. The ring was warm against her skin, and Sarah smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow she would wake to coffee and quiet companionship and work that mattered. Tomorrow she would tend her garden and mend clothes and maybe, if she was brave enough, reach for Joe's hand across the supper table. Tomorrow she would continue building this strange, sweet life from the ashes of the old. Tonight, for the first time since leaving Pennsylvania, she felt truly free. The winter morning dawned cold and clear, frost glittering on the scrub grass like scattered diamonds. Sarah woke to find Joe already gone, but coffee waited on the stove and biscuits in the warming oven, their usual routine. Except today felt different. Today marked 6 months since she'd stumbled off the stage in Cedar Ridge, broken and afraid. She dressed carefully in the green calico she'd made from the fabric bought on that first trip to town, fingers brushing the steel ring that had become as much a part of her as breathing. In the kitchen, she found something unexpected on the table, a small wooden box she'd never seen before. Inside was another ring, this one clearly old, made of gold worn thin by years of wear. A simple band with tiny flowers etched around it. A woman's wedding ring. Elizabeth's ring. She realized with a catch in her breath. Beneath it was a note in Joe's careful hand. She would have wanted it used for something good, if you're willing. I'd like to make us official, real. Will you marry me? Joe. Sarah sank into a chair, both rings before her on the scarred wood table. The steel ring he'd forged from old metal, marked with the brands of his ranch. Their ranch. The gold ring worn by a woman whose ghost had slowly, gently made room for the living. 2 circles, 2 stories, waiting to become one. She found him in the barn, mending tack with steady hands, though she could see the tension in his shoulders. He looked up when she entered, and she saw everything in his eyes, hope, fear, love that had grown so gradually she'd hardly noticed until it was as essential as air. It's not about replacing her, he said quickly. Elizabeth, it's not about that. It's about choosing to live again. Choosing you, choosing us. Sarah crossed to him, taking his calloused hands in hers. I know, she said simply. Yes, 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 I'll marry you. Yes to all of it. To the ranch, to the life we're building, to whatever comes next. She squeezed his hands. To something real from something broken. Joe's smile transformed his weathered face, and suddenly Sarah could see the young man he'd been, the one who'd loved Elizabeth with wholehearted devotion. But she could also see who he was now, older, scarred by loss, but somehow deeper for it. Like a river carved by floods, running stronger for the trials. When? He asked. Soon, Sarah said. Before spring roundup, I want to plant the garden as your wife. They were married 2 weeks later in the Morrisons' parlor, with Kate beaming and James standing as witness. It was nothing like the wedding Sarah had imagined as a girl. No white dress, no church bells, no crowd of well-wishers. Instead, she wore her best calico and the 2 rings, steel on her right hand, gold on her left. Joe wore his one good shirt and expression of quiet joy that made her chest tight. The circuit preacher, a man aptly named Shepherd, performed the simple ceremony with dignity despite having ridden 30 miles that morning. He didn't ask questions about their past, didn't raise eyebrows at this pairing of a mail-order bride and a hermit rancher. Out here, people understood that sometimes you took happiness where you found it and didn't examine it too closely. Do you, Joseph Coleman, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Sarah saw Joe's slight hesitation at the false name, but his voice was steady. I do. Do you, Sarah McAllister, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do. No mention of love or obedience, honoring or cherishing. Just simple promises to take each other, to choose each other, to face whatever came as one instead of 2. When the preacher pronounced them married, Joe kissed her, the first time their lips had met. It was gentle, careful, a question more than a statement. Sarah answered by leaning in, by letting her hand rest against his cheek, by smiling against his mouth. Kate had prepared a wedding lunch despite Sarah's protests, and a few other ranch families had somehow gotten word and stopped by. Sarah found herself surrounded by women she barely knew, all treating her like she'd always belonged here. They shared recipes and gossip and complaints about the weather, and she realized with wonder that she had neighbors now, a community, a place. As the sun set, she and Joe drove home in companionable silence. The ranch looked the same as when they'd left that morning, but everything had changed. This was truly home now. in law as well as feeling. That night, standing in what was now their bedroom, Joe had quietly moved his things that afternoon. Sarah felt a moment of uncertainty. They'd lived as careful friends for months, maintaining proper distance despite the growing connection between them. Now that barrier was gone, and she wasn't sure how to bridge the gap. Joe seemed to sense her nervousness. "We don't have to change everything at once," he said softly. "We've got time, all the time in the world." But Sarah thought of time lost, chances missed, lives cut short. Elizabeth hadn't had time. The woman from St. Louis hadn't had time. Who knew what tomorrow would bring? She stepped close to him, this man who'd saved her without trying to own her, who'd offered shelter without price, who'd waited patiently for her to heal in body and soul. When she kissed him this time, it wasn't gentle. It was sure and strong and full of promise. "I don't want to waste any more time," she whispered against his mouth. "We've both been alone too long." What followed was tender and careful and right. Two people who'd known deep loss learning to trust again, to open again, to believe that maybe happiness wasn't always followed by sorrow. Sarah had expected awkwardness, but there was only rightness in the way they moved together, as if they'd been waiting for this moment since that first day in Cedar Ridge. Later, lying in the darkness with Joe's arm around her and his breath warm against her hair, Sarah touched the two rings on her hand. The steel one caught moonlight from the window, practical, handmade, unique. The gold one seemed to glow with its own soft light, delicate, traditional, carrying the weight of another love story. "Tell me about her," Sarah said. "Elizabeth, tell me the good memories." She felt Joe's surprise in the way his body tensed, then relaxed. "You want to hear about her? She was part of making you who you are. I want to know all of you, not just the parts that started when I arrived." So he talked, quietly, about a woman who sang while she cooked and argued about politics and cried over injured animals, who could outshoot most men and embroider like an angel, who had loved him fiercely and been loved in return. "She would have liked you," Joe said finally, "would have admired your strength, your practicality, the way you've made the garden flourish." "I would have liked her too," Sarah said, meaning it. "Though I'm glad I didn't have to share you." Joe's arm tightened around her. "No sharing," he agreed. "You've got all of me now, whatever that's worth." "Everything," Sarah said firmly. "It's worth everything." They fell asleep like that, curved together like two parts of a whole, while outside the winter wind sang through the desert. In the morning there would be coffee and chores and the sweet routine of shared life. There would be challenges too, drought and storms and the harsh realities of ranching. Town gossips would talk, wondering about the hasty marriage between the hermit and the fallen woman. But tonight they were just Joe and Sarah Coleman, husband and wife, two survivors who'd found their way to each other across miles and years and sorrows. The gold ring and the steel ring caught the moonlight together, different but harmonious, like the two lives now joined as one. Sarah's last thought before sleep took her was that she'd traveled so far to find home, not in a place, but in a person, not in the life she'd planned, but in the one that had emerged from ashes and hope and the patient work of healing. She'd answered an advertisement for one man and found another, lost herself and discovered someone stronger. Come west seeking security and found something far more precious, a love built not on pretty promises but on daily kindness, on shared silence, on the choice to keep building even when everything else had burned. Tomorrow she would wake as Sarah Coleman, rancher's wife, with work to do and a life to tend. But tonight she was simply held, simply happy, simply home. The ring forged from old steel would never tarnish. The ring worn smooth by another woman's love would continue its journey. And Sarah herself, transplanted and transformed, would bloom in this desert soil, proving that some things could indeed be made real from something broken. Outside, snow began to fall, rare for the desert, but not impossible, like love after loss, like hope after heartbreak, like two damaged souls choosing to believe in tomorrow and finding themselves right to do so. A year later, The ranch barely resembled the quiet, isolated place Sarah had first seen from Joe's wagon. Not in its physical appearance, the adobe house still sat low and solid against the landscape. The barn still stood straight and true, but life had filled the empty spaces. Sound had replaced silence, and purpose had transformed mere existence into something richer. The biggest change stood behind the house, a rough schoolhouse built from lumber Joe had hauled from town. With real glass windows Kate Morrison had ordered from Denver as a wedding gift. Every morning, 6 days a week, children arrived on horseback or in wagons, some traveling miles for the chance to learn their letters and numbers. Sarah stood in the doorway now, watching her students scatter for lunch. The Hendricks boys raced toward the corral to admire Joe's horses. Little Mary Patterson sat in the shade with her primer, lips moving as she sounded out words. The Martinez twins helped their younger sister with her slate, patient as Sarah had taught them to be. Mrs. Coleman. Timothy Morrison, Kate's oldest, ran up with a composition clutched in his hand. "I finished my essay about the cattle drive." Sarah took the paper, scanning his careful penmanship. The boy had promise and hunger for learning that reminded her of herself at that age. "This is excellent work. Timothy, your descriptions are very vivid." He beamed and ran off to join his friends. Sarah watched him go, one hand resting on her still flat belly where new life grew, a secret she'd share with Joe tonight. After the photographer left. The photographer. Sarah shook her head at the thought. Joe's idea, surprisingly. "Want to mark this?" he'd said simply when she'd questioned the expense. "Want to remember how it is right now, this exact moment." She understood. They'd both learned how quickly life could change, how precious the peaceful moments were. Having a record, proof that this happiness had existed. Yes, that was worth the photographer's fee. Inside, she found Joe already cleaned up and wearing his good shirt, the one from their wedding. He stood by the window, watching the children play. And Sarah saw the soft expression that crossed his face whenever he looked at them. The man who'd lived alone for so long had adapted to chaos with surprising grace. "Photographers setting up by the garden," he said without turning. "Thought that would be fitting?" The garden, Sarah's pride, though it was theirs now in truth. What had started as a small patch had expanded to feed not just them but provide extra for families who struggled. Tomatoes and beans climbed handmade trellises. Squash sprawled between rows of corn. The desert soil, enriched with compost and carefully irrigated, had proven more generous than anyone expected. "The children want to be in the photograph," Sarah said. "Course they do." Joe turned, smiling slightly. "Wouldn't be right without them. They're part of this place now." That was Joe, understanding without being told that their family extended beyond blood, that these children who came to learn were part of what they'd built together. They gathered in the garden as the afternoon sun slanted golden across the desert. The photographer, a thin man from Tucson with elaborate mustaches, fussed with his equipment and muttered about light. Sarah and Joe stood in the center, surrounded by children arranged by height. Some fidgeted, but most stood proudly, understanding this was something special. "Mrs. Coleman, perhaps you could hold this?" The photographer produced a book, one of the primers Sarah used for teaching. "And Mr. Coleman, if you could rest your hand on your wife's shoulder." Yes, like that, natural, but dignified. Sarah felt Joe's hand, warm and steady through the fabric of her dress. His thumb moved slightly, a private caress that made her smile despite the photographer's instruction to maintain serious expressions, please, just before the exposure. She noticed what Joe had placed on the small table beside them, a wooden box, lid open to display its contents. The portfolio with Elizabeth's portrait, visible but not prominent. The wanted poster, folded so only a corner showed. Her burned dress's last button, which she'd saved without telling him. The advertisement that had brought her west, and in the center, the contract for the school, signed by all the local families. Not hidden, not destroyed, just there, part of their story. Acknowledged and accepted. "Everyone very still now," the photographer commanded. and dove beneath his black cloth. In that suspended moment, Sarah felt the weight and wonder of it all. A year ago, she'd been broken, terrified, alone. Now she stood surrounded by evidence of a life rebuilt, a husband who'd shown her that love could be quiet and steady and still run deep, children who called her teacher with reverence, a home that sheltered without imprisoning. The flash exploded, capturing them in that instant of contentment. Later, after the photographer had packed up and the children had reluctantly headed home, Sarah and Joe sat on the porch in their familiar chairs. The evening was soft, painted in pastels, and the desert had that peculiar quiet that came when the wind stilled. "I have something to tell you," Sarah said. Joe looked at her, instantly alert to her tone. "Good or bad?" "Good, very good." She took his hand, placed it on her belly. "We're going to have a baby. Come winter." His face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, fear, wonder, before settling on something that looked like awe. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. I've suspected for weeks. But Kate confirmed it today." Joe's hand spread across her stomach, protective and wondering. "A baby," he repeated. "Our baby. Are you happy?" "Happy." He pulled her from her chair onto his lap, holding her close. "Sarah, I don't have words. I thought that part of my life was done, thought I'd had my chance and lost it, but you've given me everything I'd given up on. A wife, a family, a reason to build instead of just survive." Sarah leaned into him, feeling his heart beat against her back. "We've given each other that. Neither of us would be here without the other." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Inside the house, evidence of their shared life filled every corner, her books mixed with his on the shelves, her sewing basket beside his leather working tools, the quilt they'd chosen together covering their bed. "I was thinking," Joe said eventually, "about names, if it's a boy." "Joseph," Sarah said firmly. "Joseph Coleman, Jr." "Your name, the one you chose, the one that matters." She felt him swallow hard. "And if it's a girl?" Sarah had thought about this. "Hope," she said, "because that's what we've built here, what we've found in each other." Hope Coleman. Joe tested the name. "I like it. Elizabeth would have liked it too." And there it was, the easy inclusion of the past in their present. No jealousy. No pretending she hadn't existed. Just acknowledgement that love wasn't diminished by being shared across time. "The children will be thrilled," Sarah said. "They've been pestering Kate about when we'd provide a baby for them to fuss over." Joe chuckled. "Those kids have you wrapped around their fingers," says the man who spent last Saturday teaching Tommy Hendricks to rope because the boy looked sad. "That's different. That's practical skills." "Uh-huh." Sarah turned to kiss his jaw. "You're going to be a wonderful father. You already are. To every child who comes here." "They're lucky to have you," Joe said. "We all are. Sometimes I can't believe you stayed. That first day, when I brought you here. I expected you to rest up and move on. Find somewhere safer, easier." "There is nowhere safer," Sarah said simply. "You gave me space to heal, time to choose, freedom to become myself again. Or maybe for the first time. Do you know what a gift that was?" "You gave me the same," Joe pointed out. "Showed me I could trust again, love again, that the past didn't have to define the future." The night deepened around them, bringing the familiar sounds of the ranch settling for sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There was always something on a ranch, always work to be done, problems to solve. But there would also be children's laughter, shared meals, quiet evenings like this one. "We should go in," Sarah said eventually. "Long day tomorrow. The Hendricks boys are bringing their cousin to see about enrolling." "Another student?" Joe shook his head in mock despair. "Soon you'll need a bigger schoolhouse? Would you mind?" "No," he said, standing and pulling her up with him. "Whatever you need, whatever makes you happy. That's what I want to build, a life that makes you happy." Sarah wrapped her arms around him there on the porch, their home solid behind them, their future growing within her. "You already have," she whispered. "Every day, you already have." They went inside together, Joe banking the fire while Sarah checked that everything was ready for morning. Such ordinary tasks, but sacred in their simplicity. This was what love looked like in the real world. Not grand gestures, but daily choices. Not perfect people, but broken ones choosing to heal together. As she prepared for bed, Sarah caught sight of herself in the mirror, sun-browned, strong, serene in a way she'd never been back east. The woman looking back at her had survived betrayal and brutality, had crossed a continent on faith and found it rewarded in ways she'd never imagined. Tomorrow, the photographer's image would begin its journey to becoming reality. Chemicals and silver capturing a moment that would outlive them all. But the real image, the one that mattered, was written in the land they worked, the children they taught, the life they'd built from ashes and hope. Joe came up behind her, arms wrapping around her expanded waist. In the mirror, their eyes met, gray and hazel, steady and sure. "I love you," he said simply. Words he'd probably said to Elizabeth 1,000 times, but somehow still fresh, still his to give. "I love you too," Sarah replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Outside, a coyote called to the moon. Inside, two people who'd thought themselves finished with dreams prepared to welcome a new one. And somewhere between the two, between wild and tame, past and future, broken and whole, a love story continued to unfold. Not the love story Sarah had imagined as a girl, full of poetry and promises. Something better, a love built on truth and trimmed with trust, strong enough to hold whatever tomorrow brought. In the end, that's what the West had given them both. Not easy lives, but authentic ones. Not perfect love, but enduring love. Not the futures they'd planned, but the ones they'd earned. And it was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you all for listening to this story of love and redemption in the Old West. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and let me know your thoughts on Sarah and Joe's journey. Did their story touch your heart as it did mine? Share your reflections, and I'll see you in the next tale from the frontier.